Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara.
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on the hippocampus and computation in the hippocampus, which is arguably my favorite brain region.
Nice.
So I want to begin by explaining where the hippocampus is and what it does, and then go over some theories for hippocampal function and how it plays a powerful role in the computation of information and information representation by the brain.
Nice.
Okay, so what is the hippocampus? It's a brain region found in all vertebrates, and it's located quite in the middle of the brain. We have two hippocampi, one on each side of the brain, and it's located in the medial temporal lobe, and it plays a major role in learning and memory, which is why it interests me so much. And the reason that there's a lot of attention on how the hippocampus works is because quite long ago it was discovered that damage to the hippocampus causes anterograde amnesia, which means that you're unable to form or retain new memories after the damage occurs. And so this can already tell us a little bit about its function of being important for forming memories. It's also one of the first places to suffer damage in Alzheimer's disease, which also then contributes to the memory loss symptoms.
As well as, I think, epileptic seizures.
Yeah, it also often is damaged in epilepsy, and this is due to some mechanisms which I'll briefly cover later. And importantly, linked to all of this, a mechanism that is thought to underlie memory called long-term potentiation was actually discovered in the hippocampus and is thought to occur at multiple stages of hippocampal processing. So overall, the hippocampus is super important for learning and memory, and this is why we're interested in it.
Yeah. And just a little fun fact in between, the hippocampus actually has its name from the Greek origin of seahorse, and that's due to its structure. If you look at any images of the hippocampus, it does resemble a seahorse, and
Yeah.
I think it makes for a really beautiful and easily noticeable location in the brain to study.
Yes, it's so beautiful.
Yeah, to image,
Yeah.
we know immediately where it is.
Yeah. And at multiple axes as well, because it's like general structure is this curved seahorse-like shape, but then if you cut through that cord, it's a similar sort of like spiral C shape.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And a key thing about the hippocampus is that it receives and integrates information from all over the cortex, including sensory information, information about space, internal information about our own movement, and emotional information. And this is why it's such an important processing stage, because it sort of like takes all of this different type of information and integrates it all to create our own representation of the world.
And memories.
Yes, and then form memories, which then helps us understand
And recall previous experiences.
that influences our future actions. So there are some important theories of hippocampal function, one being the hippocampal indexing theory.
What's that about?
Similar to what I just mentioned, this was formulated in 1986, and it's that experiences are stored as patterns of activity in the neocortex, and these can be driven by the hippocampus. So in order to recall an event, the hippocampus stimulates this certain pattern of activity in the neocortex, which is different for every experience that we have.
So would different patterns of activity be related to different firing rates of neurons? So like...
That's a really good point. So I kind of assumed at first that this theory suggested patterns of activity, meaning different regions stimulated, but I think patterns in terms of neural activity can definitely always be defined in terms of temporal and spatial. So the different neurons that are activated, as well as the temporal dynamics of their activation.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say both are involved.
Yeah. Because what I was trying to get at is this pattern theory similar to pattern separation?
Yes, I'm definitely going to cover pattern separation and pattern completion. soon.
Like, awesome.
Yeah.
Sorry to jump ahead.
No, it's definitely one of the most fascinating parts of the computational theory.
Yeah.
But so what I've just explained is the hippocampal indexing theory, and alongside that is a very influential theory or conceptualization called the cognitive map hypothesis. So this was formulated by O'Keefe and Nadel in 1978, and it's that the brain builds a representation of the spatial environment, and this supports our memory and guides future actions, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's the importance of understanding space and using spatial representation as a framework for our experiences to exist in.
Yeah. I hadn't realized how fundamental our spatial cognition and awareness is. It's so important, given that the location of the entorhinal cortex and the medial entorhinal cortex is so close to the hippocampus.
Yeah, and they're the main inputs to the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, and it also contains cells that respond to various aspects in space, which I won't go too much into because it can get very complex. But yeah, for sure, like, I think just thinking about the hippocampus made me realize how important spatial information is for, like, conceptualizing the world in our brains.
Yeah.
And it's one of the, like, this is why there's so much interest in the research world on spatial navigation and learning and processing, because it really is like our sense of space and time just really influences everything about our experience.
Yeah, it kind of raised the question for me, is it possible to have any type of cognition that doesn't involve an element of space and integrating spatial information?
Yeah, there's actually, like, papers going over why so a type of memory that is responsible for remembering events is called episodic memory, and there's papers exploring why episodic memory is the same thing as spatial memory, because you can't really dissociate the two.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe different types of memory or knowledge, like semantic memory, like knowledge about or memory of facts, might not require spatial memory, but about events, for sure, it involves space. Yeah. Also, really important thing is I was just reading a paper by Epstein et al. In 2017 where they mentioned that spatial navigation isn't just spatial, but it's also navigation of our social space. So there's like an aspect of abstract space and processing of this information, and how this is why, like, understanding or navigating a social space and our interactions with other people obviously guides social behavior, just like how understanding physical space guides physical motor behavior.
Yeah.
So that's exactly like you said, how important spatial information is in all aspects, including abstract spatial information. Maybe we should also mention that we both are doing research right now in a lab that does study spatial navigation and learning and memory. I just have in my notes, let's reconceptualize time and space based on how our brain does it.
Like consciously be aware?
No, like, let's understand how time and space works by understanding how our brain processes this information and represents this information.
That's like almost like reverse engineering physics. Like, we'll understand physics via the biology.
I actually think that quite often, because ultimately everything we study or know is from us as being human and through our brains.
Yeah.
So how can we understand that knowledge if we don't actually understand how our brain processes that knowledge?
Yeah, I agree, except that if we did take that approach, we would take forever to reach any conclusions, because we know so little about the brain.
I know.
In 2022. I think physics has done some good progress without...
Yes, there's a need for both, but, like, that's why I am a full supporter of neuroscience in collaboration with other sciences, because I think this is really important, and, you know, baby steps.
Yeah.
In the future, we'll have this understanding of what we know, incorporating how we know it through our brain.
Yeah, and the human perception of it.
Yeah. Wow, yes, it's very complex though. My brain is kind of exploding. Maybe our
like
brains
meta.
are not made to do that though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another quote by a famous scientist, Howard Eichenbaum, that I really liked and how to conceptualize what the hippocampus does is, he said, it creates a representation of multi-dimensional inter-event relationships in memory space.
That sounds so complicated.
Yeah, but okay, so to simplify, firstly, I like the use of memory space to show that there's a representation of space in another space.
Yeah.
But secondly, it's the idea of like creating neural circuits that link physically different events. And so there's like this representation of the relationship between different events in order to remember them.
Okay. Could you give us an example?
So we are aware that I brushed my teeth this morning before I left the house because we have the inter-event relationship.
Yeah.
And
so the sequence of events.
Yeah, we remember these events in relation to each other, not only solely on their own.
Yeah, in of themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, something else I briefly wanted to cover was this really interesting concept of the hippocampus transforming space, again, to time, back to space.
Oh,
so
okay.
How this works in my conceptualization of it is that real space, like physical space in the world, is processed by neurons in the hippocampus by their activity patterns, right? So neurons fire action potentials, and this encodes space. Now, the key thing here is that it's the timing of their firing that encodes space. Well, it's both, as I mentioned before, it's both the specific neurons that are responsive to specific locations or features of space, as well as their timing. But if we just focus on the temporal coding, there's this aspect of their activity patterns representing space. And this is really interesting because there's a lot of patterns in this temporal coding that have been explored. So there's theta waves that occur throughout the hippocampus, and then within each theta waves there are smaller gamma waves. So there's 7 gamma within each theta cycle. It's been shown that neurons that encode specific locations in space, known as place cells, fire at a specific point within a gamma wave within a theta cycle. And so in this way, they're phase locked within the theta cycle.
Okay, yeah.
And so this is a really good example of how important like temporal regularity encoding is to encode space. Oh, and also another important thing is called phase precession. And this is basically when we're then moving through space, the same neuron that encodes for location, because the location has now changed in relation to our body, it fires at a time point earlier in the wave than before. And this is called phase precession. And so this like change in the relation of the neuron firing to the regular waves encodes spatial location. Does this make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
Good.
It's really interesting how the firing neurons related to space need to have like a specific temporal aspect to it so that the brain then knows where you are in relation to the space.
Yeah, exactly. And the way I see it is just that the hippocampus like forms this representation of the world in its own way through its activity patterns and through its circuitry and the dynamics between the neurons within it. And then this creates our own perception of space, and it can just do it, and it's like responsible for all of our experiences. It can just do so much. It's just incredible.
Yes, it is incredible.
Okay, so then I just wanted to go over the hippocampal circuit, because a key thing is that there's a very classical and simple circuit within the hippocampus made up of 3 main regions, and it's thought that information sort of flows mainly unidirectionally, so like always in the same direction. And each region has like a very specific function. So it all starts in the entorhinal cortex, sending its inputs to a region known as the dentate gyrus. And this is a really special region because it shows extremely sparse activity and the neurons take a lot basically to become activated. And so this is why it is known for a function called pattern separation, like you mentioned earlier. What pattern separation is the breaking down of similar input patterns into dissimilar output patterns so that similar memories or events can be recalled as separate. And so, for example, as you mentioned about epilepsy, in temporal lobe epilepsy, which is the most common type of epilepsy, it can also influence the hippocampus, since the hippocampus is located in the medial temporal lobe. And studies have shown that the neurons in the dentate gyrus in mouse models of epilepsy show pathological firing activity. So they fire too much, more than they normally would. And this is thought to negatively impact their normal ability to perform pattern separation. And this is why a lot of people with temporal lobe epilepsy also experience minor memory impairments. So this is a really, important function. First, breaking down all of the inputs into these very sparse activity patterns. Now, these then travel to a region called CA3. CA stands for cornu ammonis, because of like the horn-like structure of the circuit. And then this is also another really interesting feature. The cells from the dentate gyrus, they send really powerful but few synapses into CA3. And so these are known as like detonator synapses because they're just so powerful, and they're also like carrying these sparse inputs to neurons in CA3. And so this is thought to be important for the storage of information because there's a lot of plasticity mechanisms that occur at these synapses that enable information to be stored through these strong detonator synapses. Okay, then within CA3, this is potentially the most interesting region of the hippocampus because it contains a lot of neurons that are interconnected to each other. This is known as an auto-association network, and it's thought to be super important for our ability to recall events because of how highly interconnected all the neurons are. So if you are presented with a partial cue, is what we call it, of a memory, so say like
smell.
Yeah, a smell is a really good example. So I smell some roses, and then the information goes through the entorhinal cortex, it goes to the dentate gyrus, it goes to the CA3, and just certain neurons in CA3 are activated, but they're interconnected. So then it, through this like huge network, activates other neurons that are responsive to other features of this experience, like the green grass and the and the taste of lemonade on a hot summer's day.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly remember this event of like your summer holiday back in 2003. And so this is a really cool mechanism that enables recall. And the CA3 neurons send their inputs to the CA1 region. Don't question the numbers, it's kind of weird. There is 2 and 4, but we're not going to talk about that. And the interesting thing about CA1 is that it's most responsible for behavioral output, and the firing patterns in CA1 are actually the most accurate representation of the spatial context. So it's basically a fuller representation of the experience because, as I mentioned, the dentate gyrus, the first relay, really breaks down all the inputs. The CA3, the auto-association network, it sort of like recombines all this information and then sends its outputs to the CA1, which creates this full representation of all the inputs to the circuit in the first place. So it's this really interesting idea of the hippocampus breaking down and sensory information and all the information it receives, like processing it in all these computationally complex ways, and then ultimately just creating its own version of what it received.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's just so fun. And then that's leading to behavioral outputs. So it's just like this huge integrator, transformer, important for...
And filter.
Yeah, such a big filtering effect on information. And it's like we should really just be questioning the information that we have and we're aware of, because think about all of this processing stages it's been through. And I think this is mainly all to enable learning and memory, because it's so important to be able to recall events. And like that's why there's all this processing occurring and all of these connections and patterns.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Yeah.
And then you've mentioned how basically information inputs and gets separated and segregated, but also what about then how it reconnects to other areas in the circuit? So how CA3 or CA1 connect back into the entorhinal cortex, and then how it's like a bit of like a loop, because
it's definitely a loop. Yeah. So the CA1 sends its outputs back to the entorhinal cortex, and also those then get processed coming from CA1 to go further to the neocortex, and this is a whole other story. This is thought to be important for the formation of long-term memories, and it goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the hippocampal indexing theory, that that patterns of activity in the neocortex encode different experiences, and these can be driven by the hippocampus. And so that's for, in long-term memory, then hippocampal outputs from CA1 through the entorhinal cortex to the neocortex activates these different patterns that each represent an event.
Yeah, really interesting.
And that's how the hippocampus works in a really short summary.
It's also a neat summary of top-down processes. So like how information, top-down and bottom-up, so how information gets integrated into your brain, in this case the hippocampus, and then how information outputs once again into the entorhinal cortex and the neocortex, and how this alters the way that we perceive the information in the first place due to these strong memory formations and the different firing rates, and how it shifts our perception of things.
Yeah, it is responsible basically for our perception of everything.
Yeah.
And also, why our prior experiences influence our beliefs so much and influence how we take in new information so much. Because of the hippocampus.
Yes, it's like the master coordinator pulling the strings.
And although people who study the thalamus would argue that the thalamus is instead
I do find the thalamus really interesting.
The thalamus is really a master coordinator.
Yeah, it's a very good like relay system for all of the input and output information going in. Yeah.
But hippocampus memory.
Yes.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I really hope you enjoyed and find the hippocampus as fascinating as I do.